Hey everyone, welcome to the debut episode of System Update with Glenn Greenwald, a new video program brought to you by the Intercept, devoted to in-depth discussions of political and social issues by airing perspectives and voices and views not typically heard in other venues. We intend to broadcast this show at least once a week on the Intercept's YouTube channel. There will be an English language version of the program, which is this, as well as a Portuguese language separate version of the program for our Intercept Brazil audience, with occasional crossover with subtitles whenever the topic suggests it makes sense to do so. System Update is actually a show that we had been developing and planning and even beginning to produce prior to the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. The intention was to partner with a Brazilian TV network to broadcast the show both on television as well as online. And obviously our plans were interrupted by quarantine and isolation, but we decided nonetheless to launch a stripped down version of the program because we have a team of, though working remotely, highly adept and skilled and dedicated professionals who are capable of producing a very compelling show. Obviously, with this pandemic, we all have a lot more time on our hands, and there's also as well, because of the cancellation of things like sporting events and live TV programs, a demand for fresh new content, and it's our hope that this program can help fulfill that demand and contribute to what it is that people want and need to hear. For our first program, we deliberately chose not to focus exclusively or even primarily on the COVID-19 pandemic, in part because I think we all reach a saturation point emotionally and psychologically in talking and thinking about this health crisis, but also because there are so many specialists who are providing highly informed and important analyses of every aspect of the pandemic, and chose instead to focus on a topic that is extremely important but hasn't really received as much attention as it deserved, which is the effective end of the 2020 Democratic presidential nominating contest, and specifically the failure for the second consecutive national election of the Bernie Sanders campaign, despite generating all kinds of successes, the failure to achieve the ultimate goal of becoming the nominee of the Democratic Party, overthrowing the establishment wing of Washington Democrats, and ultimately ascending to the White House. And to discuss that failure and the reasons for it, we have two highly interesting guests who come from the topic with very disparate voices. The first is Kyle Kulinski, who is the host of the wildly popular YouTube program, The Kyle Kulinski Show, also known as Secular Talk, who is a vocal supporter of the Sanders campaign, yet always with a critical eye. And the other guest is Liz Franczac, who is the co-host of a relatively new and incredibly fascinating podcast, of which I have become a devoted, even addicted listener, called The True and On Podcast. And Liz talks about these events from a somewhat more systemic and analytical framework than Kyle does, whose analysis and critique is very concrete of the Sanders campaign. So I hope you enjoy our first program. I also hope that you will subscribe to the Intercept's YouTube channel, which will enable you to regularly watch not just this program, but all of the original content we produce, and to help our program evolve and grow by participating, by offering ideas and suggestions, and by sharing it. Thanks very much. The 2016 Democratic Party nominating process was an extraordinary event by every measure. It was, for 2 years prior, widely assumed that only one person, the former First Lady, two-term New York Senator, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, had any viable chance of becoming the Democratic Party's nominee. And yet a then very obscure and unknown senator from the tiny state of Vermont, not even a Democrat, a lifelong independent, Bernie Sanders, with no apparent framework of support or funding model, fought her all the way to the Democratic Party convention, winning 23 states, 43% of the vote, and one could reasonably argue would have been the party's nominee had it not been for improper intervention and even cheating on the part of the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic establishment. Remember, the improprieties revealed during the course of the campaign forced the resignation of the top 5 officials of the Democratic National Committee, including the then chairwoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So it was an incredibly contested election, way beyond what virtually anybody assumed was possible. And yet the 2020 Bernie Sanders campaign was a completely different story in essentially every respect. To begin with, in 2020, Bernie Sanders was not an obscure figure. Quite the contrary. He had virtually universal name recognition. He had built immense popularity within the Democratic Party, had demonstrated that he had the capacity to raise huge amounts of funds through small donors without relying on super PACs or bundlers or corporate donors, and was going to be formidable by every measure. And yet, despite generating some significant successes, including fortifying this funding model of relying on small donors and creating a movement that gave rise to people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others, the 2020 Sanders campaign has to be regarded as a failure when it comes to the ultimate goal, absent some extremely unforeseeable event, of securing the Democratic Party nomination for Bernie Sanders and then ultimately ascending to the White House. And the fact that it was a failure as compared to 2016 and as well in absolute terms is demonstrated by all kinds of facts, including the fact that there are states that Bernie Sanders won in 2016, such as Minnesota, Michigan, and Washington State, that he failed to win in 2020. And there were trouble signs even early on when it was regarded by many people, including me, as though it looked like Bernie Sanders was consolidating his status as a front runner, even when he tied in Iowa. That should have been a warning sign, not just because he didn't win over Pete Buttigieg, despite narrowly losing Iowa in 2016, but so many of the kinds of voters that propelled the Sanders campaign in 2016, such as rural voters, people who don't really regard themselves as hardcore loyalists of the Democratic Party, voted for Sanders in 2016, yet not in 2020. Pete Buttigieg won many, if not most of those voters, which is what enabled him to compete with Sanders in Iowa. And then even in New Hampshire, which Sanders did win in 2020, he won by a very small margin as compared to 2016 when he blew out Hillary Clinton by 22 points. Now, it is true that the field was more divided. In 2016, there were 5 candidates to begin with, 2 of whom dropped out before Iowa. The third, Martin O'Malley, dropped out immediately after, and so he was one-on-one with Clinton basically from the beginning, whereas this time through South Carolina, the field was very divided, and so perhaps that's comparing apples and oranges. After Super Tuesday, he was able to run one-on-one against Biden the way he was able to run one-on-one against Clinton in 2016. And if anything, things got worse from there. That was when he lost the state of Washington and the state of Michigan, 2 states he won in 2016, followed by blowout losses in Florida, Indiana, and Arizona. I think it's critical not to replicate the pathology of the 2016 Clinton campaign and the 2016 Democrats of blaming everything and everybody else for their loss and refusing ever to engage in any kind of self-critique or analysis about why this loss happened. It certainly is true that there are villains one can assign blame to. There was still some cheating by the Democratic Party as evidenced by the fiasco in Iowa, though I think it's very hard to say that Bernie Sanders didn't ultimately lose in a fair and democratic race to Joe Biden once the two of them were one-on-one. So I think it can't really be claimed that Democratic Party cheating was the primary or even a significant factor. It could be the case that the Democratic Party is simply ideologically anathema to the kind of insurgent left-wing politics that Bernie Sanders was trying to mount. But I think that it's very critical at this moment where there's incredible opportunity in terms of left-wing populist politics due to the realignments that we're seeing all over the democratic world as a result of the blatant failure of neoliberalism, as well as the unraveling of the political order and even the social order due to the coronavirus pandemic, to try and draw lessons from the failure of the Sanders movement and the campaign in 2020 to learn lessons about how the populist left can mount a more successful campaign and a more successful movement, not just in the United States, but throughout the democratic world going forward. To begin that analysis, to me, the most significant metric of illustrating the failure of the Sanders campaign between 2016 and 2020 was the loss of rural voters and the kinds of voters who don't identify as hardcore partisans. To underscore that point, there was a headline in the Huffington Post by its political reporter Kevin Robillard in March, headline, quote, "Without Hillary Clinton in the race, Bernie Sanders' rural edge disappeared. Joe Biden is winning in rural areas where Sanders romped in 2016." And you can go through different states and see evidence of that one after the next. In Michigan, for example, which Sanders won in 2020, he lost virtually every demographic group. In 2016 in Missouri, where Sanders won the rural vote, he got blown out with the rural vote by Joe Biden. In Idaho, even though it shifted from a caucus to a primary, the same development took place. And then perhaps most compellingly in North Carolina, in 2016, Bernie Sanders won a huge part of the western region of that state and yet lost most of those precincts. In fact, in 2016 in North Carolina, Sanders won 35% of the precincts in North Carolina. In 2020, he won 7%. Why did that happen? Why did Bernie Sanders not only fail to expand his 2016 base, but see an erosion of a lot of the voters? Perhaps it's true that in 2016, a lot of the votes he got were simply votes motivated by a severe animosity that people harbored to Hillary Clinton that they just simply don't have for Joe Biden. It's also possible and probably likely that the consolidation of the entire establishment in a very dramatic way after South Carolina behind Joe Biden convinced lots of voters to vote for Biden in a way that didn't quite happen in 2016. But it's very hard to give that certainly all of the blame, given that that's what establishments do. For me, there are three major factors that explain why, in my view at least, Bernie Sanders did worse in 2020 than in 2016, despite massive institutional advantages and name recognition that he didn't enjoy 4 years ago. The first is that Sanders has become, despite his independent status, an ingrained part and member of the Democratic Party. And I think there's an inherent incompatibility between saying that you're running an insurgent race against the establishment wing of a party in order to bring about a political revolution, to have that on the one hand be your messaging, and then on the other hand be too entrenched within that party, too friendly to its leaders and elites to really run the kind of campaign and engage in the kind of rhetoric that an insurgent candidacy requires in order to win. You can contrast Donald Trump in 2016, who ran as an insurgent against the Republican Party and had not a kind word to say about any Republican elites. Quite the contrary, he was unfettered and unlimited and vicious in his denunciations of them. And even if you don't believe that Bernie Sanders should have replicated that, I think there's a very strong case to make that he was far too deferential to the people that he needed to denounce in order to make a convincing case that the Democratic Party needed overthrowing rather than continuation. There was an article in the New York Times, for example, on March 21st entitled "How It All Came Apart for Bernie Sanders." And it quoted numerous Bernie Sanders aides and supporters as saying that he simply prohibited any attacks on Joe Biden that he regarded as being too extreme. It read, quote, "In conversations with associates, both men agreed that it might make sense to criticize Mr. Biden in a sharper way," referring to two of the top Bernie Sanders campaign aides. But they said Mr. Sanders could not be persuaded to do so. He and his wife, Jane Sanders, liked the Bidens personally, and their word was final. In fact, it even went so far in terms of protecting the Bidens that the New York Times reported in this article that a particularly pugnacious campaign aide, David Sirota, had blasted out to the Standard's email list a column in The Guardian by the highly respected good governance expert Zephyr Teachout, essentially arguing that Joe Biden was corrupt. And because Bernie Sanders was so offended that someone from his campaign would raise issues of Joe Biden's corruption, David Sirota, according to the New York Times, was punished for having done that, barred from speaking on behalf of the campaign, and barred from traveling with the campaign again. He simply wanted to run against the Democratic establishment as an abstraction, but had one foot outside the party, but one foot for decades in it, and therefore was incapable of mounting the kind of aggressive condemnation of the Democratic Party establishment wing that probably was necessary to convince large numbers of people to abandon it and ignore their leaders' decrees to vote for Joe Biden and instead vote for him. We caught a glimpse of that in 2016 when early on he exonerated Hillary Clinton in his famous or infamous declaration.
Let me say something that may not be great politics, but I think the secretary is right. And that is that the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too.
A second major factor is one that I think left-wing leaders have confronted but not yet figured out how to navigate, not just in the United States, but across the democratic world, which is how is it that you successfully reconcile and appease and feed the prongs of the coalition that you need to assemble in order to run in a successful insurgent campaign without alienating one or the other. You can look at those prongs, those constituencies or factions, as composed of three different groups. One is the working class that Bernie Sanders spoke very well to, as evidenced by his strong rural support in 2016 and not quite as well to in 2020. You can look at suburban affluent liberals, also known as the Elizabeth Warren voters, who compose a small part of the party, which is why her campaign was such a failure, but still 7 or 10 or 12% that you need if you're going to mount that kind of a challenge. And then you could say the third group are younger voters who are in large part moved by identity politics or the politics of woke liberalism, which Sanders has always struggled with. He's been incredibly successful in attracting young voters who care about class issues and has had greater difficulty attracting those kind of voters. You see the same struggles with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, with Mélenchon in France. There's really been no populist left-wing leader since Lula da Silva in Brazil who has successfully mounted that kind of a nationwide campaign that brought them to power in a way that adhered and kept those coalitions together. And I think that those coalitions are growing a little bit apart and the challenge becomes even more difficult. And so you could make the case that by trying harder to, for example, appeal to suburban affluent liberals who sit in front of MSNBC and watch those shows all day and whose politics are formed by that, Sanders ended up alienating the kind of rural voter or the kind of voters who don't view Donald Trump as, for example, the root of all evil in a way that caused his campaign to have its base eroded. If you look at Pete Buttigieg, for all his faults, I think the reason why he was able to do so well in Iowa and steal a lot of those rural voters and soft partisans from Sanders in Iowa was because he was out there saying what Sanders wasn't, which was Donald Trump is not the root of all evil. The broken political system in the United States didn't begin on January 20th, 2017, and we cannot be a party devoted to simply restoring the status quo prior to Trump. That was a message that Bernie Sanders was successful in imparting in 2016, that it's not just Democrats versus Republicans that we need to navigate, and I think he was much less successful in 2020. And that leads to the third factor, which is I think Sanders became a more conventional Democrat, which is something that you can do if you're running as the establishment candidate like Joe Biden, and something you absolutely cannot do if you're running as an insurgent, an outsider, a socialist, somebody trying to bring about political revolution. In 2016, Sanders hyped the fact that he was an independent. He was proud of the fact that he viewed both parties' establishment wings as corrupted. He constantly spoke about his rejection of bipartisan orthodoxy in a wide array of areas. In 2020, it was a much different story, whether because it was a strategic calculation or because he really believed it. He began sounding like every other Democrat in many respects when it came to things like how to view the Donald Trump presidency. Is it just a symptom of a broken political system, which is true? Or is Donald Trump this kind of singular evil where the only goal is to just uproot him and America is restored to its greatness? He mouthed the party line on Trump, on impeachment, on Russiagate, and sounded very much like an MSNBC Democrat. Not always. There were certainly unique components of the Sanders campaign, and especially his politics and his ideology that he maintained that was very anathema to the funding base and the corporatist base of the Democratic Party. But in his rhetoric and in his tactics, he did become more of a conventional Democrat, and I think that alienated a lot of people who had been attracted to him in 2016 who don't want a conventional Democrat, who were excited about overthrowing the Democratic wing, the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, and who began to look at Sanders and hear him as more of a standard Democrat, and therefore their enthusiasm for him waned. Whatever else is true, it is really beyond the realm of debate that the Sanders campaign simply failed in multiple critical goals of expanding its base beyond 2016, of energizing young voters to the point where new voters were swarming to the polls in order to elect him. And it's easy to place the blame on others, and a lot of villains deserve that blame. But it's critical to dig deep and understand what mistakes the Sanders campaign made, principally in order to avoid those mistakes in the future and to continue to build on the momentum that Bernie Sanders generated for the American left for the first time in many, many years to provide a viable and serious threat to the Democratic wing of the establishment party. The model is there, the foundation is there, but it once again fell short and therefore needs to be regarded as a failure. So I'm very excited to have on our debut program Liz Franczac, who is a writer and the co-host of a podcast of which I've become such an obsessive fan that you guys might have to take out some kind of restraining order against me. It's the True and On podcast. I've spent a ridiculous amount of my quarantine time catching up on old episodes, listening to every new one as soon as it comes out. So I'm really excited to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time, Liz.
Thank you so much for having me. It's amazing that you're a fan. Thank you for listening.
I am. I'm a creepy level fan.
No.
So we decided kind of like in this concerted way not to talk on the first program about the pandemic that has disrupted all of our lives, because I think a lot of us, I know speaking for myself and a lot of people I know, you can reach a saturation point very quickly, and there's still a lot of things to talk about that are worth talking about, including I think the fallout from the 2020 primary and what looks to be like the Democrats being on the verge of nominating the very vibrant and exciting Joe Biden as their presidential candidate. But before we get into that, let me just ask you, how are you holding up? How are things on your end with all of this apocalyptic climate?
I'm okay. It's definitely up and down. I keep saying that. It's weird. You know, that I'm in the Bay Area. The atmosphere in the Bay Area is very strange. We're definitely, I think that the situation in San Francisco is pretty serious, as far as like where different hot spots for infection are throughout the country. The situation in the United States, I think, is very concerning, but Yeah,
absolutely. So that just before we get into what we're actually going to talk about, I do just want to recommend the last two episodes of your podcast, where I think that you, especially for a younger audience, do a great job of talking about what has, I think, been neglected, maybe for good reason, but is super important, which is how to cope with kind of the mental health burdens of being locked in your house, of losing your routine, of not being able to be near loved ones or friends, and how to kind of try and find purpose and some kind of connection, even with all of this separation. So I thought it was an incredibly thought-provoking and unexpectedly kind of apolitical and very humanistic way of talking about this pandemic that I really recommend people listen to. It's the last couple of episodes. So Liz, let's talk about the 2020 primary and the impending Biden nomination and what I think we can adequately describe as the second mildly successful, though ultimately failed, attempt by Bernie Sanders to run an insurgent campaign that's at least mildly to the left of the orthodoxies of the Democratic Party. So what is your kind of takeaway of the ultimate lack of success of the Bernie Sanders campaign? Is it that the Democratic establishment is so intrinsically corrupt and they cheat so much that no one can win who opposes them? Is it that the Democratic Party electorate is just too conservative for a campaign with this kind of ideology? Or is there something, are there important self-criticisms that the Sanders campaign and its supporters need to engage in order to figure out how better to do this?
I'm gonna say D, all of the above.
Yeah.
I think that in order to kind of understand, I mean, not to quote Hillary Clinton, but to understand what happened, you kind of have to go, like you said, go back to 2016. And, I think what's been the, most concerning part of the whole Biden, primary, whatever, his campaign being a success pretty much, is how much he was able to run on just earned media, right? And there was you really start to see the outsized influence of the media apparatus with the Biden campaign. And he ran pretty much the same game that Trump did in 2016 with the GOP, which is that no field offices, no organizing, not a lot of, initially not a lot of money. Trump, actually ran a small donor campaign, which has also been kind of written out of the history books, but is important to understand. And so Biden was able to really just kind of be this manufactured candidate in a way that I don't think left liberal progressives really saw coming or appreciated. So there's that part of the story. And then I think the other, a really crucial part of the story is understanding the differences between 2016 and 2020 in terms of the shape of the Democratic Party and also what voters were responding to. Basically, the 2016 primary electorate in both the GOP and the DNC were really emerging as a reaction to the status quo. In the same way that I think in a lot of ways that the Obama, the quote unquote Obama coalition, if we want to,
the 2008 version of that.
Right. Which, just as an aside, I'm not fully convinced that is actually a thing, or that
the
there
Obama
is that
coalition.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of ways that what people call the Obama coalition, which that derives from the New Deal coalition, right? But that lasted 12 years, 25 years. That's an actual coalition. This lasted 4 years because remember there was a big drop off in 2012, right? And then a continued drop off in 2016 of Obama to Trump voters. But so
you see the success of 2008 Obama not as him constructing this new political force in American politics of African Americans at high levels of enthusiasm, affluent liberals, or now known as the Warren campaign, and then young voters, which flock to the Sanders campaign, and nobody's been able to piece those three components together again. It was just kind of a generalized reaction to anger against the status quo, which Obama, with his outsider status, was able to become a vessel for. And the coalition just sort of ended up almost organically forming around him.
Yeah, it basically emerged out of a reaction, I guess is what I'm saying. And so to kind of consider it a coalition seems misplaced considering it's so unstable, right? So so you see the same thing emerge in 2016 with Sanders, where I think so much of what people were responding to was, their frustrations again with the status quo, because again, I don't need to tell you this, obviously, but Obama was pretty much just a continuation of the Bush years in core respects, right? And so
Yeah, yeah.
people, yeah.
But so Liz, let me ask you that then. So and I agree with you. I agree with that completely. I think that the 2008 Obama campaign, the 2016 version of Trump that destroyed the GOP establishment, and one candidate after the next supported and propped up by it, and then won in the general election, had a lot of obviously complicated factors, as every election does, but the overwhelming primary overriding one was that each of them successfully persuaded enough people that they were the vessel of anti-establishment and anti-elite anger, and ran as outsiders. So if we take that premise that I agree with, and is not just a premise that is shaping American politics, it explains the enactment of Brexit in 2016 in the UK, and then the subsequent ratification of it with Boris Johnson, the rise of a lot of these kind of anti-establishment far-right parties that are never part of the conservative establishment. I definitely think it explains the election in Brazil in 2018 of Jair Bolsonaro. Was much more about anti-establishment anger and much less about some kind of an ideological set of beliefs. What went wrong for Bernie in 2020? I mean, did he just not, was he no longer a sufficient symbol of anti-status quo or outsider sentiment, or has that sentiment gone somewhere else?
Well, I think that, the liberal left, however we want to call that, I never know how to what to call people or what's appropriate, progressive left, whatever, basically took all the wrong lessons from 2016. And they said, okay, Bernie was speaking to an electorate because of all of these things he was proposing, all of these, to a point I'll get to in a minute, all of these plans, all of these policies like, $15 minimum wage or healthcare for all or, whatever. And in some ways, I think it was, not to get Freudian, but what they were really saying was, this is what I responded to, and projecting that onto the electorate, right? And so they basically assumed that there was a movement emerging when, Bernie doesn't, I guess my whole point in comparing him to Obama is that he doesn't emerge out of a movement, right? He emerges as a reaction. And so you had a kind of consensus explaining what went wrong for Hillary, and also kind of the, where, what Bernie was speaking to, that ended up, I think, kind of codifying wrong lessons that then kind of propelled us to the moment that we are in now. So
what do you see? Go ahead. Yeah, I'm very interested in that. So a lot of people, I think or assume that Bernie in 2020 was pretty much a comprehensive facsimile of what he was in 2016, just kind of turbocharged, like more money, more name recognition, more organization. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's been changes in his messaging and in his approach. And they might be subtle, but I'm not sure. So what, do you see the 2020 version of Bernie as different than the 2016 version of Bernie? And obviously, from what you said, and I guess the results kind of would suggest this as well, whatever those changes weren't very good ones. The best you can say about Bernie is that he kind of maintained, and I think he even went backwards. So what do you see there?
I think that from what I've seen from people is a tendency to kind of blame that on him or his campaign. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is those decisions are basically emerging because of the changes that happened in the Democratic electorate from 2016 to 2020,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
like we know for I mean, it's just, this is true, like, the Dem party has moved right since 2016. You can look at the 2018 midterms as a complete I mean, it bears out completely where the richest suburbs are where the Democrats are picking up new seats. That's where they're flipping new places. They flip, Virginia legislature with all of Bloomberg's money, et cetera, et cetera. Like, they are
Like
moving
Bloomberg's
rightward.
money, ex-CIA agents, ex-military,
Exactly. So it's,
entrepreneurs,
everyone
suburban
makes,
entrepreneurs.
yeah, everyone makes fun of
Nothing to do with the
Schumer
working class.
saying,
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin.
everyone make fun of
yeah.
that because it didn't work for Hillary, but actually, I mean, it is working for the Democratic Party. And so you had progressives kind of start operating from, well, we can just get this electorate, which is like comprehensively moving right, structurally moving right, to somehow, quote unquote, move left. And it didn't, it's like not enough people appreciated, that that these are like irreconcilable antagonisms. And, you can't, Bernie basically had to win back his base before he could reach out to anyone else in the electorate. And that was a big problem, I think. And I guess that's what I'm kind of getting at with the like policy and the plan stuff. I mean, I know that we ascribe that to Warren's campaign, which again was a big problem. I mean, a really big problem for the Sanders campaign, right? But that logic emerges out of the way the left commentariat viewed the success-ish of the 2016 Sanders campaign, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Why? I guess then the two questions for me become, and I have one of the reasons why I've been so vehemently critical of resistance ethos politics and the way in which the Democratic Party chose to oppose Trump, because it was so often done from the right, using jingoistic and militaristic scripts, accusing him of insufficient loyalty, resuscitating the Cold War framework and accusing him of being in bed with the Kremlin, like sounding like Bill Buckley or like J. Edgar Hoover or some like, hideous love child of the two, and constantly accusing their enemies of being in bed with foreign powers. And never really getting to Trump's left on anything resembling economic populism. So when you start depicting Trump and his evil, not as this kind of right-wing threat, but really as almost like this unpatriotic, opponent to the system, it makes people more conservative in the sense that they want to defend the system, which ultimately is the ethos of conservatism.
Yeah.
And then that does make it very difficult for a campaign that is, speaking almost in terms that is in a language that the Democratic electorate really doesn't speak. So does that mean to you that the Democratic Party and its electorate, which is one of the options I gave you on my long menu at the beginning, is just not hospitable any longer to a movement or to a candidate that wants to run on a populist or working class agenda, or one that's anti-militarist or questioning U.S. imperialism, because the base of the Democratic Party believes in those things?
I don't know. I think that's like the $100,000 question or whatever the saying is. Like, it's so hard because, again, over the last 4 years, like you rightly point out, all that resistance crap, it's, everyone has been basically disciplined into anything, Trump is fascism, therefore anything, outside of Trump is good because it's not fascism. And it's been an incredible disciplinary tool, not just the Dem electorate, but also on the left, And because of that, there has been no counter narrative that's been able to emerge to explain what's going on, you know? Like, I'm hesitant to blame the voters or the electorate, I guess, for that reason, and rather say, okay, I'm of the mind that the DNC, like as a party, is pretty much just like a shell. It's kind of a front, in the same way the GOP is, in that the GOP is just basically, the evangelical groups work as basically like behind the scenes to funnel money into, whatever the GOP decides is its plan, and there's different kind of infighting there. But the DNC is the same way. And so it's hard to understand the kind of ecosystem of, the party such as it is, without understanding the different organizations and the different, all the different money that is moving around behind the scenes. Like you said at the beginning of our interview, is it just that the DNC is cheating? Is it just, whatever? And it's like, yeah, okay. But, they do that for a long, all the time.
Yeah, that's never, they've been doing that forever. They're not going to ever stop.
But
that's
it's
part
also
of the obstacle to be overcome, right?
Yeah, but it's also like we don't have a left movement that is comfortable saying Emily's List or Planned Parenthood are structurally fighting against women's health care, right? Because they are. Planned Parenthood and Emily's List work very hard to make sure we don't have Medicare for all. Now, if you want to secure women's health care in this country, you do it through universal health care.
Yeah, so let me ask you about this critique then, because I think that this does get to the heart of, because one of the questions in which I'm most interested is, did the Sanders campaign fail in the sense of not being the nominee because it made mistakes that either were the byproduct of just strategic mistakes that campaigns make, or that Bernie was an imperfect candidate or the wrong candidate or the wrong vehicle for this kind of a movement to emerge? Or did it fail because it wasn't a winnable fight? Like, no matter how perfect the campaign would have been or the candidate would have been, just can't win this kind of a campaign in the Democratic Party, given all the structural obstacles you've described. And one of the things I look at is Trump in 2016, which you compared to Biden in ways that I think are valid, but you can also look at what Trump did as being the challenge Bernie failed to do, which was he just battered through the Republican establishment, viciously mocking and condemning and insulting and demeaning one establishment representative after the next, starting with Jeb Bush and then Marco Rubio, and then finally, when they got desperate, Ted Cruz, until there was no one left standing.
Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq.
While Donald Trump was building a reality TV show, my brother was building a security apparatus to keep us safe, and I'm proud of what he did. And he's had the gall to go after my mother.
The World Trade Center came down during your brother's reign.
He's had the gall to go after my mother.
Remember that.
Hold on.
Let me finish this. He's had the gall to go after my mother.
That's not keeping
Look, I
us
won
safe.
the lottery when I was born 63 years ago and looked up and I saw my mom. My mom is the strongest woman I know.
She should
this
be
is
running.
not about my family or his family.
You are all talk and no
Name
action.
one
What I've
specific thing you've
seen
done.
up here, first of all, this guy's a choke artist and this guy's a liar. You have a combination.
This guy always goes.
You have a combination of factors. He
This is
can't
so
do it for the
typical.
obvious reason, and he can't do
here's
it
the
because
typical
he
thing he
doesn't
does.
know how to tell the truth.
And he successfully channeled this hatred on the part of the Republican voting base toward all these institutions that had long been the Republican establishment, the Chamber of Commerce and like the military industrial complex. And like, there's no left-wing movement to talk about the Democratic establishment, not as like wayward friends who have just gone a little wrong, who like are kind of imperfect, but as like the enemy that needs to be fought and destroyed. That like Bernie just isn't that person. And then the question is, I don't know, is the solution going forward to find that person? It's been hard for anyone on the international left in the Democratic world to find that right person.
Yeah, I wonder, I think there's kind of like two prongs there, because I think it is true that he ran at least much more vocally against, as he calls it, the establishment, against Hillary, right? I think some of that, I would imagine some of that has to do with his personal feelings about Joe Biden versus his personal feelings about Hillary Clinton. I'm just as a
As a person, as like a person.
yeah, I mean, I could see that being a factor.
But even with Hillary, he had that famous line towards the beginning of the campaign of "I'm sick and tired of hearing about your damn
Right.
emails." Like, imagine Donald Trump, defending an adversary by dismissing and minimizing this like looming FBI criminal investigation
Right.
on the grounds that it's irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
So even there, his instinct was kind of to say, let's not get into questions of character or try and like demean you. Let's just have like a good faith policy difference as friends, and whoever wins, we shake each other's hands and then we endorse the other one and campaign for the other one as president.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that I could ascribe to like, I don't think they ever even thought they would get as far as they did in 2016. So it really was a campaign about issues in that way, perhaps.
Right.
But I do think that this time around, again, like, it's funny. I feel like this disciplined, kind of more conservative Dem electorate, they just wanted someone who could beat Trump. And rather than kind of go with where the voters were on that, the progressive left said, no, we're going to make it about issues. And this is the kind of thing that also happened with Corbyn in a lot of ways. And I'm hesitant to make the comparison there because I just think that the situations in the UK and the US are very different. Although I do think that perhaps some of the critiques of, labor and kind of new tendencies in labor and like the US progressive left, like perhaps there's something to talk about there. But putting that aside, like, you start telling people this laundry list of we're going to do all these things, we're going to do all these things, we're going to do all these things. But the electorate just wanted someone who could beat Trump. So it's like kind of like a mismatch there. And I think the question is, well, why did that happen? Like, did you want to make it about all these pet issues, which then, by the way, got you in a fight with Elizabeth Warren about who's the most quote unquote left with all these laundry list issues, which then split your base, by the way, while not letting you get into any of the people that like Pete or Biden really spoke to, which were just like older, not super online, not super, politicky voters. Like you weren't able to basically win over both. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But what's interesting about that is like in 2016, Bernie's base, contrary to a lot of conventional wisdom, did include a lot of people who are not typical kind of online leftists. Like he won huge numbers of rural votes and like people who don't identify even necessarily as Democrats, who are like more independent types who like the fact that he wasn't a member of the Democratic Party, that he didn't sound like a Democrat. And then you go to Iowa and like Pete ends up winning all those, most of those rural votes because, I guess one theory is like maybe Bernie in 2020 started sounding more like a standard issue Democrat, like saying Trump is the greatest threat to U.S. democracy, the kind of thing that like gets you all aroused if like you're a Rachel Maddow viewer, but like isn't something that you really believe if you're, like a less kind of politically tuned in partisan, who kind of liked Bernie in 2016 because of his idiosyncratic approach and then didn't like him sounding like that, confining him to that, more caricatured left-wing base that he, as you say, he ended up having to share with Warren. So it got even smaller. And so I guess like the question then becomes like, if you're a leftist and you hate the neoliberal order and you see this alternative that you don't like, which is, economic populism fused with xenophobic nationalism, which is a very potent combination that's winning in a lot of places. Like you live in a country or at one, and so do I, which are two very different countries if they have that in common. It's winning like a lot throughout Western Europe. What is like the substantive alternative, and then what becomes the tactical alternative? Like, is it just like, hey, let's wait till, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is like 35, and then, she'll get to like unite the Warren voters and the Sanders voters and a bunch of other people and activate and kind of like try and put together some kind of Obama coalition? Or is it just say, you know what? The Democratic Party is just shit. And it's like, it's just unreformable. And we're not going to vote for it, and we're not going to give our support to it. We're not going to be bullied into it because of like kids in cages and like whatever phrases they use, because Obama put kids in cages and so will Biden. And then just look for some other means of social change.
I mean, to put my cards on the table, like, I haven't voted for a Democrat in over a decade, so it's not up to me. Like, I'm already, I don't care for
And
the
that would be
Democratic.
true even if you didn't live in like California, but in like Ohio or some swing state.
Yeah, I don't care. Like, no, I hate them. Like, I want to burn the party to the ground and salt the earth so it can never come back. I think it's an abomination. And I will say, like, being in the Bay Area, like I'm literally in the like imperial core of the Democratic Party apparatus, being in Silicon Valley and like with all these tech people and all these millionaires around. And it feels impossible. It feels like cyberpunk insane future in the city.
You live near the woman who gave the $14.5 million to Elizabeth Warren.
Exactly. I mean, yeah,
these
these people are terrible. These are not, like you said, they're not our problematic friends that we need to like kind of sway to our side, as if you can. I mean, that's the thing. You can't sway capital. Like, it's just, this is an antagonism. You know what I'm saying? So like, I don't think the Democratic Party is reformable, like in any way. But I also think that like, I know we're not supposed to be talking about Corona, but I think this pandemic really throws a bunch of things like, it's like the whole world is changing overnight. I mean, I said this on the podcast and I was talking to a friend about this the other night. It's like, we're witnessing the complete collapse of free movement in the European Union. Like, I don't know what that means politically going forward.
Well, and I also wonder as well, what it's going to do, because one of the things I think we forget about, and I've given a lot of thought to this over the last month or so, as the social order seems to be in serious jeopardy, like acute, immediate jeopardy. We've lived through this like insanely aberrational period of stability and stagnation and satisfaction, like we in the Western world, where things just kind of plod along because there's been this propaganda model that's been fed to people about what they should and shouldn't value, joined with like a relative prosperity, like obviously not for most people, but enough to like, their kids aren't like starving to death and they don't have their immediate survival threat and they're just hanging on enough by a thread to kind of placate them with enough crumbs. Now what you're having is like, we're about to see huge numbers of people dropping dead because they just don't have access to healthcare while they watch, extremely rich people hoarding huge amounts of resources who can save their families and themselves. The kind of thing that has always historically led to radical revolutionary change, right? Like, it's going to have to, there can't be millions of people watching what's going on with this pandemic and say, yeah, I'm kind of good with like massive income inequality because I think they've earned it, right? Like, survival is now at stake, and that's going to start radically altering how we see these things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would say, I'm hesitant to say revolutionary change just because I don't think there is a revolutionary movement in the West. Mm-hmm. But like you mentioned, I do think there's like a there's a right-wing counter-revolutionary movement. As I'm watching like the news happen, I'm thinking, okay, we've got countries closing borders and starting to hoard oil. This is not a good situation. Historically, when that's happened, that's not been a good situation, right? I think my big worry is that I don't know where the left goes from here, because it does seem that at least in the United States, these sort of more, like you said, these kind of conservative revolutionary forces emerging on the right, it's not necessarily that they have popular legitimacy yet, but there is like a kind of a war going out or starting to emerge about who is going to have popular legitimacy. And I don't see anyone or any kind of movement emerging, I mean, across the West, out of any kind of left wing. Everyone seems kind of just frozen, which it's like I understand. But again, it's like because the left has no institutions. The left for 30 years has spent all its energy capturing academia and the media, which, by the way, two failing institutions, crumbling institutions, and they have nothing to show for it. It's a very
the process
dangerous
has lost any connection with, the vast amounts of mass movement that it would need to tap into in order to succeed. I mean, in Brazil, I think Brazil has like the last successful leftist leader who succeeded in doing that, which is Lula da Silva. And he was a labor leader who like came from, labor organizing and from a family of, people who were illiterate until they were 10, and he lost a finger in a factory, and he was able to he had nothing to do with academic elites who mocked him and hated him and looked down on him. And the more they did it, the more people kind of got driven to his arms, much the same way like Trump's misspelled tweets do. And I think you're right. I think until the left kind of fundamentally goes back to those roots, unfortunately, like the working class is going to continue to go toward the one side that seems to be welcoming of it, which is not the one embracing and hanging out in Silicon Valley and Wall Street speeches and cocktail parties, but is the one talking about, wage stagnation and bringing jobs back from free trade because of the other countries that are stealing it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're entering into a new era, it feels like. That's my suspicion. I don't know what the kind of political landscape is going to look like in 3 years. I have a suspicion. I mean, I keep calling this like capitalism's great leap forward, because what I kind of can see happening is, look, Michael Roberts, the Marxian economist, is saying that we should expect up to like 50% job loss. That is unprecedented in history, right? Like, it's a very insane situation we find ourselves in, and it's not difficult to see how this accelerates a kind of, leap toward the Singaporification of the United States or something like that.
Yeah, or the world more broadly.
Absolutely.
Even. But yeah, well, Liz, I wish we had a lot more time. And I think it's interesting that we kind of began by vowing that we weren't going to talk about the pandemic. And it ultimately turns out that it's so transformative on essentially every last level, economically, politically, culturally, socially, that you really can't meaningfully talk about anything without confronting it. But we're so close to the beginning and nowhere near the end that it just kind of raises a lot of fascinating questions for which there really aren't any answers. But I'm really thrilled that I got to take the time to talk to you for the first time. This is the first time we've gotten to chat. If you don't yet know TrueAnon podcast, you should immediately go and listen to it, as I do a lot. It will teach you and make you think about a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you so much.
All right, be well.
Bye.
So I'm delighted to welcome to our debut program the host of the Kyle Kulinski Show, the wildly popular YouTube program, which for me will always be known as Secular Talk. And Kyle as well was a supporter of the Bernie Sanders campaign, though always looking at it with a critical eye and still does. And so in a lot of ways is the perfect guest to dissect and analyze what happened. Kyle, I know that time is not really a premium for any of us at this point with self-isolation, quarantine and the like, but I nonetheless really appreciate your taking some to talk to me.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be, the first episode. This is special.
It is special. So Obviously we have made the kind of concerted choice to talk about something other than the global pandemic, which is affecting all of our lives in a pretty radical way, in part because I think we all reach a saturation point, and there are other things that I think are worth talking about that kind of provides people a little break from that. But before we get into all of that, the 2020 primary, the Sanders campaign, and what lessons can be drawn from that, how are you doing? How are you holding up on your end under these very difficult conditions?
I'm good, but funny enough, I happen to be in an area that's kind of like a hot zone of the virus. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, which was where the first case in New York was. I still live in Westchester, which is the same county, but not there. But I live close enough to there where it was like, oh, okay, so this thing is like right on top of me. This is an epidemic. It's the real thing. And in my opinion, they should have shut down everything 2 weeks ago. That's what I think. That's the only way to avoid where we are now.
Yeah, it's absolutely the real thing. Here in Brazil, I would say we're 7 to 10 days behind where the U.S. is, certainly the large metropolitan areas, and yet everyone I know already knows somebody affected by the disease, and the peak is still pretty far away. So obviously best wishes to everybody in your life who's affected by it, and as you try and navigate, and they try and navigate through all of these restrictions and limitations that we're all newly getting accustomed to. So let's turn to...
You too, man. You too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So let's turn to talking about the 2020 Democratic primary and the Sanders campaign. You were very vocal about your support for the Bernie Sanders campaign. You were one of the original founders of Justice Democrats, which helped to lay the foundation for a lot of the growth of the Sanders movement, born of the 2016 campaign, grew out of. And I think it's fair to say that we're either at the end or certainly very close to the end of the Democratic primary, and it's far, far, far more likely than not that Bernie Sanders once again, despite some successes, is not going to be the Democratic nominee. So you can describe the campaign in some ways as having some successes, but the ultimate aim of making him the nominee seems once again to be a failure. And I'd like to start off by asking you why you think that is. What are the principal reasons? Does it have to do with cheating by the Democratic establishment, as I think was certainly true in 2016? Is it the nature of the Democratic Party just isn't ultimately amenable to an insurgent or socialist style challenge to the establishment? Or did the Sanders campaign make some important mistakes that future insurgent or left-wing candidates ought to learn from and study?
Well, before I answer that, and that's a great question, I just want to take a step back and say what I think they did right, because this is a campaign that got closer to the White House, and they're, a genuinely left campaign. Certainly the closest in my lifetime, and, you could argue the last one was FDR. So they have a lot to teach us, and then also you're correct in saying they made a lot of mistakes and that, there are many adjustments that can be made. And I'll get into the adjustments, but first I just want to say, up until Super Tuesday, their strategy was basically flawless. And I say that because they were winning. They won Iowa.
Okay, so let me just interrupt you just for a second there on that premise. I think after FDR, there were a couple of successful left-wing campaigns, like the campaign of Henry Wallace and especially Eugene McCarthy in 1968 when he knocked Lyndon Johnson, who was the incumbent president, out of the race by basically winning or getting 40% of the vote in New Hampshire through a rising anti-war sentiment, although he ended up not winning and the establishment ended up getting in Hubert Humphrey. So he didn't win in the ultimate sense there either. But I do wonder whether or not the first several states of Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada were as successful as they seemed to be at the time. In Iowa, you can call it a first place tie with Pete Buttigieg. He certainly got more votes, but ended up with a few less delegates. But however you want to count it, it's kind of an ideal state for Bernie. He was there, since 2016. He seems to have lost a lot of rural support to Buttigieg. And then in New Hampshire, his neighboring state, he won, but by a very slim margin. Certainly Nevada was a blowout. So what was that early stage that people now view as largely successful, really as successful as it should have been, given the massive head start that he had over the other candidates from 2016?
Well, I would actually say, even given everything you just laid out there, yes, because the goal of the campaign, the strategy that they've basically admitted at this point, was, all right, we have a fractured field. There's about 1,000 candidates running. So what we're going to do, what our goal is to make sure we mobilize our solid 30% chunk in every respective state, and that should be enough to get us the nomination. That was the mindset. That was the goal. That was, the way the campaign was structured and what they were aiming for. And I do think that they were successful. You're correct in pointing out that they lost quite a bit of rural support, not only in the early states, but later on as well. But at least in terms of...
But why? Okay, why did that happen, though? I mean, that's a big deal, right? Rural support for Bernie in 2016 was a big base of his success, and one thing you don't want to do is lose support your second time around. You want to build on that and expand it. So why did he lose rural support to some of the other candidates?
Well, I think one of the main reasons is that a lot of the support that he was getting in the 2016 primary in those areas was really just an anti-Hillary vote, in that she was the only other, candidate that he was running against. This time he had many, many other candidates to run against. So even the fact that he lost some of that support in the early states, that wasn't necessarily a red flag for me, because when people have 10 different options and, you still have Bernie at least cobbling together enough to win, to me, there weren't red flags yet. Now, I can get to the red flags, but...
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I think when you end up winning or almost winning Iowa, win New Hampshire, have a blowout win in Nevada, the first three states, it's by all metrics a very good start, on top of which it wasn't just the results, but those Super Tuesday polling that was showing Bernie ahead in almost all or most of those critical states, which is what made people view him as the consensus frontrunner heading into South Carolina, which is when it all kind of began to unravel. So when you talk about red flags and unraveling, what is your analysis of that unraveling?
Right. So first of all, I do think that there were some things outside of Bernie and the campaign's control that ended up being effectively the perfect storm that worked against him. And the thing that I think they couldn't do anything to change really was what I call Bloody Monday, which is the establishment coalescing. And that coalescing worked. I mean, you had Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete drop out on the same day, endorse Biden, presumably for, some cabinet position or whatever. You had Beto O'Rourke. He was brought in because the idea was, hey, maybe he'll help in Texas, and some polls were leaning in Bernie's direction in Texas. And you had, again, Obama apparently facilitated all of this, and he made the phone calls behind the scenes, which I think is fascinating and says quite a bit about Obama. And so at the time, on the day it happened, there was really an open question. Hey, how is this going to impact the race? Because there were some polls that showed, a plurality of Mayor Pete's supporters would go to Bernie. And so there was a question, maybe this will even help him. But it turned out that that wasn't true, and the endorsements actually did something, and it gave Joe Biden's campaign an injection of adrenaline that they definitely needed.
Right. So let's just stop there really quickly.
Yep.
So that idea, right, that the less successful establishment candidates were cajoled, persuaded, coerced, whatever ended up happening, whatever mix there was, and it wasn't just Pete and Klobuchar, it was also Bloomberg, and then the whole series of endorsements that fell after that, is kind of the thing that A, establishments do, B, is probably not illegitimate, right? I mean, it's something that candidates try and do, is line up the failed campaigns behind them, and C was pretty predictable, right? It was always probably going to be the case that there was going to be one last establishment candidate standing against Bernie, and Bernie's ultimate mission, sort of the video game last challenge, was to beat and vanquish that candidate. So all of that, you're right, while not in Bernie's control, was probably part of the landscape that could be easily predicted and anticipated.
I agree with you that it should have been anticipated. I don't think it was. And what was very apparent to me after that day is that they had absolutely no plan to deal with that. And frankly, they didn't know what they were doing. and they doubled down on what at that time was the wrong strategy, and then ended up losing. So
okay, so let's focus on that. So once Bernie gets blown out by Biden in South Carolina, and first of all, let's talk about, before we get to the aftermath of that, South Carolina itself, which is traditionally an incredibly important state in the Democratic Party nominating process and in the Republican nominating process. It was highly anticipated that Bernie had problems with African-American voters, especially in the southern region. He had 4 years to fix it, obviously didn't. What went wrong in South Carolina? Was South Carolina something that he was just inevitably going to lose, or did the campaign start going wrong there?
Okay, well, so South Carolina, I was expecting a loss there. I wasn't expecting it to be as big as it was. The Clyburn endorsement, I think, certainly helped Joe Biden in the sense that Jim Clyburn is kind of like an old school political boss who still has sway, and he's one of the few in the country that really still plays that role. But in my opinion, that was when the unraveling began, and then Super Tuesday was when, the Bernie campaign was really in trouble. And here are the things they could have done, in my opinion, that could have given them a better chance. So first of all, I do think that they need to play the game better. And what I mean by that is they kind of ceded the ground to Joe Biden and the establishment in the sense that they never tried to match endorsements with endorsements. They never tried to successfully counter these meta media narratives that were really beginning to define the race in a clear way. And, I've spoken about this on my show, but one of the things I think that could have helped blunt that Biden media momentum, which was monumental post South Carolina, was if, when Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete dropped out and endorsed Biden and everything, if I was on Bernie's team, I would have been doing everything I could behind the scenes to court the likes of Andrew Yang and Tom Steyer and Tulsi Gabbard and just anybody to have a little asterisk in the conversations that were happening on cable news that were so pro-Biden to say, hey, okay, well, Joe Biden got the endorsements of these people, and hey, look, Bernie got the endorsements of these people. So we have a narrative that's not as dominant in one direction, because I do think that media narrative helped doom Bernie and his campaign. So the first piece of advice would be to play the game better and try to match endorsements with endorsements. The second thing is, listen, after Super Tuesday, and really you could say after South Carolina as well, it was clear that the old strategy of not going hard at Biden, that's not tenable anymore. Now you're one-on-one, and when you're one-on-one, you have to make the distinctions and be clear about it. And I think what Bernie always does is he says, hey, I'm better, here are my ideas, this is where he's wrong on policy. But he actually outright rejected the idea that Zephyr Teachow, one of his surrogates, was pushing out there, which is actually Joe Biden is corrupt. Joe Biden is the swamp. Bernie does spend quite a bit of his time talking not just against the Republican establishment, but the Democratic establishment. But it's always in, more abstract ways. Once you get into the specifics and the nitty-gritty and the nooks and crannies of it, and you say, Zephyr Teachout did, hey, here are the clear examples of Biden being the swamp, being corrupt, being the establishment that you're talking about, his family getting rich off of his public profile, the zillion examples of his son Hunter and what's gone on with him. Once you get into the specifics, all of a sudden he goes, well, come on now, that's dirty politics, that's gutter politics. I don't want to play like that. I want to be above the fray.
Yeah, I'm tired of hearing of your damn emails. It's that mentality. You think Donald Trump would have, created that space for one of his opponent's ethical scandals to just be dismissed away that way?
No way. But beyond that, because I think the problems go deeper than that, though, Glenn, because, yes, I do generally agree that, you needed to be more aggressive, you needed to call him corrupt, you needed to do this after Super Tuesday. But the other thing is the polls completely flipped when it was one-on-one versus Biden and Bernie, in the sense that Bernie was leading on the issue of electability. And then when it became one-on-one and after Super Tuesday, the polls immediately flipped, and you had a 70-30 split where 70% of Democratic voters were saying, actually, now Biden is the more electable candidate. So what Bernie needed to do, and I didn't see him do it at all, I just saw him go right back to his old strategy, which worked in the first few states and then stopped working, What he needed to do was not only make the electability argument, which was massively important, but also do it in a way that embodies the spirit of that first point that we just made, that you're the anti-establishment outsider. And so what I would have done is you should compare Biden to Hillary Clinton and say the words and say it a lot and say, hey, we just ran this experiment in 2016 and your safe establishment candidate just lost. So do you want to run the experiment again? Do you want to have Hillary Clinton 2.0? Do you want to suffer the same fate? The only way you beat a fake populist on the right, Donald Trump, is with a real populist on the left, me. And what he was unable to do is make that argument in any kind of clear, convincing way that he indeed was the more electable candidate.
He wasn't willing to make it at all. When he was asked whether he thought Biden could win, he said emphasizing, yes. I think all of these, my colleagues on the stage are not only better than Trump, I think they're all going to beat Trump. He sounded very much like a standard issue Democrat to me in 2020, much more so than in 2016. But I really question, even if Bernie had run the perfect campaign, whatever that might be, adhering to your vision or mine or some platonic sense of how you do an insurgent campaign, is the Democratic Party, in terms of how it's funded, the people who constitute its loyal voting base, the people who turn out on primaries, the people they listen to, the politics that they have, is it susceptible to a successful insurgent socialist challenge, or is that just not the ideology and politics of the Democratic Party voting base, no matter how great your campaign is? In other words, can a Bernie-style campaign ever succeed within the modern-day Democratic Party?
Now, on that front, I have good news. My answer is yes, and a resounding yes, because there's this final piece of the puzzle that we need to add, which I think explains how he could have threaded that needle. And I agree, it is a very difficult needle to thread, and it is possible that maybe after that Super Tuesday slaughter, there was nothing he could have done. But what Bernie needed to do is to sell his policy agenda, which polls overwhelmingly popular. This is why he's the most liked politician in the country and the most liked senator, and the polls consistently show that, is because on each individual issue that he talks about, people are with him. So what he needed to do was, while he still does his normal stump speech and sells these ideas and pushes these issues, Medicare for all, free college, living wage, end the wars, all that stuff, he needed to, I think, proudly embrace the label moderate and centrist. And I think the argument that could have pierced that bubble that you're talking about now is if Bernie said, listen, all these things I'm talking about, I am the moderate, I am the centrist. My point is the establishment is extreme. They're extremists. The Iraq war is extreme. The outsourcing deals are extreme. They're the problem. And I think that if that argument was made consistently enough, it would have effectively given more older voters permission to think in a new way and maybe go vote for Bernie. Because ultimately, the reason why he lost this election is older voters came out in droves. And those older voters were really driven by one main thing, according to them, which is
to beat Trump.
I want to beat Donald Trump. So that's why I'm stressing these final two pieces of the puzzle, which I think were the most important, which could have given Bernie a potential victory. Namely, you have to make the electability argument and make it in a way people understand. Compare Biden to Hillary Clinton. Compare Biden to John Kerry. Say every time we run the so-called safe choice, it doesn't work. I'm the actual safe choice. You have to say the words. You have to make sure everybody understands it. And then you also have to make sure that you embrace that label moderate, because people generally view themselves, even though they agree with Bernie on the individual issues, they don't think of themselves as socialists. They don't think of themselves as lefties. They're just normal people who go to work and take care of their families. And if you describe yourself as a moderate while you talk about these policies, that's the permission that they need. And I'll say this, Glenn, and you referenced this earlier, but the moment that I knew we were in deep, deep trouble and we were probably going to lose is the day after Super Tuesday, when the momentum of the race totally shifted and Bernie took a shellacking. The very next day, he's doing a press conference and he's asked a question point blank from a reporter, softball down the center of the plate. Hey, do you think Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump?
Do you think, say it is Biden, do you think Biden can beat Trump?
I do.
And he didn't even hesitate. And he says, yes, I do. And that's when I knew that he didn't understand the momentum shift in the race, and he didn't understand that he was ceding one of the two most important arguments that he needed to make in order to win. And if he was going
to... And this is really ultimately what I think is the lingering question of the now two successful campaigns by a bunch of different metrics in different ways, but ultimately unsuccessful in the fact that we ended up first with Hillary Clinton and now with Joe Biden. In 2016, Trump proved that a significant part of the Republican voting base hates the Republican establishment and hates Republican leadership enough so that if you viciously run against it, and not just the people, but their policies, against the Iraq War, against cutting taxes for the rich, against corporatism and militarism and all of the orthodoxies that had long defined the Republican Party other than social issues, the one area where Trump kind of affirmed, there's enough anger and despite the kind of caricature of the Republican Party voter as being this like cult-like figure, they're actually really angry at their leaders and are susceptible to a message that's very vigorously opposed. Can somebody run in the Democratic Party channeling real anger against the Democratic establishment and the Democratic leaders, or are Democratic Party voters simply too happy with and satisfied with the way they kind of worship Elizabeth Warren and swoon when she goes on Saturday Night Live, and the way to this day that when Barack Obama posts some kind of Hallmark tweet, they talk about him in almost religious-like reverence? Is the Democratic Party electorate simply too admiring of, too attached to their leadership to be receptive to messaging that says that the party leadership is corrupted and bad?
No, I think that's too fatalistic an argument, because when you look at the numbers, young people overwhelmingly came out for Bernie. I'm talking about a split of like 80-20. And even when you go to the demographic of 44 and under, he's still winning with like 70%. So, Joe Biden has massive electoral liabilities going into a general election. And none
of which Bernie was willing to talk about.
Well, you're right, and he needed to make those arguments, but I think my point of hope is it looks like, oh my God, maybe this is a mountain that we'll never be able to climb. But, guys, we were all so close, and with minor tweaks, it's possible we could have gotten there. If Bernie only lost older voters 60-40, it's possible that he could have won. If we never had Bloody Monday, Bernie could have gotten a plurality and won. So I don't buy the idea that, the hatred towards elites is only something alive and well among the Republican base and Republican voters, and not something alive and well among, the Democratic base and Democratic voters. I actually think that we're right there, and it was just a couple of very Kyle, errors.
But I think those are all valid points, but then if you accept that premise, namely that it is possible to win in the Democratic primary process, the Democratic Party nominating process, by running an insurgent campaign of the ideas Bernie has, and you also acknowledge the indisputable premise that Bernie had 4 years to campaign, he had all the money in the world that you could have needed, he had a very developed organization on the ground in the key states, and yet he didn't do what you make a very compelling case is actually possible, which is to win. On some level, you have to lay the blame for that at the door of the Sanders campaign. Is that a fair conclusion from the premises you're embracing?
Absolutely. No, I'm not trying to take away...
Yeah, no, I know you're not.
Any of the responsibility from them. In fact, my argument is very clearly that had they adjusted post-Super Tuesday in a couple very clear ways, it's very possible Bernie Sanders could have won, or at least been a hell of a lot more competitive coming down the stretch here. So I really think that all it came down to, Glenn, was they didn't at all convince the older electorate of Bernie's electability, and Bernie was still out there using the language of political revolution, democratic socialism, as opposed to saying, you know what? I'm actually a moderate. That's what I am. And I'm embracing that label because these things I'm fighting for are actually very moderate. And when you look at the rest of the developed world, they virtually all have them. So I think that with those tweaks, he could have won.
Yeah. I mean, I think, not that you necessarily want to copy Donald Trump, but he did put together a pretty impressive winning formula of something that nobody thought was possible. I mean, you can go back and look at Ross Douthat, who I think is one of the smarter Republican-leaning pundits who, has that famous, now notorious tweet saying, aren't we going to all feel stupid when Marco Rubio wins every primary? Trump overcame huge odds to win the Republican nomination with tons of money and Republican establishment power against him. And he did it by going full-fledged and full force, unrestrained attacks on the people in the establishment against whom he was running. And I think that when you mix messages and you say, on the one hand, I'm running against this evil thing called the Democratic establishment that I don't want you to pay attention to or to follow any longer because it's not any good for you. And then on the other hand, constantly call the people who lead it your friends and refuse to criticize them in anything other than very muted tones, I think it becomes very difficult to lodge people away and to get them to think that all the leaders that they respect and trust and love are telling them that Joe Biden is a good leader and that he's electable. How do you get them to change their minds and not believe that? You've got to be very aggressive in making the case. And I think Bernie's attachment to those human beings, if not the institution, the establishment itself, which he was willing to criticize, made it almost impossible for him to message in the way that you were suggesting he should have.
Yeah, and let's also be clear that if Trump had lost, I think it's very likely he just would have not endorsed whoever won, and he would have been totally fine with just walking away from that political world and having all the, babbling idiots hate him. He would have been fine with it because he's a very petty man, and when he feels slighted, he's like, okay, we'll forget you. So if he lost...
Right, whereas now it's just a matter of time as we wait for Bernie to unveil his Biden endorsement.
And that's right. And I do think that, that will frustrate somebody like me because I look at Joe Biden in a very similar way to how I looked at Hillary Clinton, basically anathema to everything I believe. So, on the one hand, I'll be mad at that, but then on the other hand, I think that he genuinely views Trump as such a greater evil that he's like, I got to do what I got to do. So he's a more serious person in a way, but I think that seriousness kind of led to the contradiction that you're alluding to there, which is I'm going to do all the anti-establishment rhetoric, but then at the same time call Joe my friend, and at the same time refuse to say he's unelectable. And then the final piece of the puzzle, Glenn, that we haven't touched on yet, or at least in any detail, is I really do think the media bears a lot of responsibility for how this unfolded. Because I think that media orgy of Biden support post Super Tuesday, or I should say the night before Super Tuesday, the day before Super Tuesday, I think that really did help shape the race. And they really have nothing. There's very few pro-Bernie voices who are staples on these networks. And, I actually felt like in some ways this election was a race between new media and old media supporting every candidate but Bernie, new media supporting Bernie. And it just, people like me just aren't big enough yet to control the narrative. We only respond to the narrative. The Intercept does wonderful work, but again, you guys are still also more responding to the narrative than controlling the narrative.
Yeah, but I think that it's important that if you want to launch what you might want to call a political revolution or an insurgency campaign or take down an establishment, you have to be cognizant of what those obstacles and barriers are. The reason they're the establishment is because they have institutional control over the most potent airwaves and flows of money. That's part of the challenge, is to figure out how to subvert that. Again, something that Trump was able to do in 2016, although he got a lot of help from networks in a way that Bernie never did. But I think one of the things, I guess, and we need to sort of end it here, but one of the things that I hope will happen. And I think Bernie supporters and the campaign are entitled to some space and some time, and the campaign's not even technically over yet. It might be by the time this comes out, but at least as of now, Bernie's saying he's reassessing and focusing on the pandemic. Is not to avoid the mistake of the Hillary Clinton campaign and all those kind of oozing, rotted DC operatives who, in the wake of their loss, blamed everybody but themselves and never engaged in any self-critique. I think it is going to be important for anybody who wants to undermine and subvert and destroy the Democratic establishment to use these two races not to just voice grievances, because the grievances, while valid, are part of the landscape and aren't going anywhere, but to understand what went wrong with an eye toward figuring out how to do it better next time, to avoid these shortfalls.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would just add on top of that I know myself and many people who are in a similar mindset, have a similar ideology, we're feeling rather joker-fied right now. And we're looking to burn it all down and cause some trouble. And I know that there are many, many people, myself included. In 2016, I made the argument that, listen, I'm in New York, it's a safe state. I'm not going to vote for Hillary in the general election because I don't have to. But I also had the massive caveat. Listen, if I was in a swing state, I'd probably suck it up and vote for her because I think Trump is a greater evil. I'm at the point now where you're not even going to get any caveats out of me. I'm done. I'm not playing this game anymore of lesser evilism. I'm not going to, be a team player or whatever. So, they're going to, I hope that the establishment political forces understand that we're actually a force to be reckoned with, the anti-establishment left, if you will. And there's no amount of shaming or calling us names or screaming at us to fall in line that's going to get them the political outcomes that they want. And I can't wait to hold up and show in their face the exit poll results on how many young voters went for Bernie, and then tell them to go cry about it when they fail to do proper outreach to those young people.
Yeah, there was a great Lawrence O'Donnell clip that I think Jimmy Dore found, or at least I saw it there first, from 15 years ago, well before his multi-million-dollar a year Comcast contract to do DNC propaganda on MSNBC, in which he was basically saying that the problem with the left is that the Democratic Party knows that no matter what it does, no matter how indifferent or how abusive or contemptuous it openly is towards the left, at the end of the day, the left is always going to give their votes to the Democratic Party because they have no place to go. And until the left learns that unconditional support means that you have no leverage, which means you're going to be ignored, the left will continue to be ignored and have no power. And the only way to put a stop to that is to make it clear that they're not going to get your support unless they do what it is that you want. That's just basic negotiating. And I think you're right that the time has come for people who do not regard the Democratic establishment as wayward friends that need to be just kind of moderately reformed, but as the enemy that needs to be overcome and destroyed, that continuing to lend them unconditional support only entrenches and furthers and worsens the problem.
Totally agree.
All right, Kyle. Well, once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Your show has become an incredible success, and rightfully so. You know that I've been a big fan for a long time. Whoever isn't familiar with it should watch it. It's the Kyle Kulinski Show, or Secular Talk on YouTube. It has an immense audience, incredible amounts of influence, and finally the media is catching up to that fact. So I really am appreciative of your coming on our first show. Thanks so much, Kyle.
And thank you, Glenn. I've always been a fan of your work as well, and I appreciate those kind words.
All right, appreciate it.